In this video, we're going to talk about animation in Blender. We're going to use cameras. We can animate cameras in Blender. We can create nice dolly movements, and we can also animate objects, and we can apply the motion blur effect once the object is moving. So we're going to see everything from the beginning, from the start. So don't worry if you never ever created any 3D animation. We're gonna see everything from the beginning. Now, in the previous videos, we talked about how to set up the render, but we talked about only static renderings. Well, actually, an animation, it's a sequence of images. So it's just like creating a single rendering, but instead, this time we're gonna render a sequence. The sequence of images can be also called sequence of frames, and we're gonna talk about more about that. Now, we can also apply the effects that we apply to static cameras also in dynamic cameras or moving cameras. So when we created the depth of field effect and placing things in focus and out of focus, well, we can do that also in the animation. So we can continue to use depth of field, and also when we use animation, we can also apply the motion blur effect, which is a really nice and realistic way to represent moving objects into your scene. Now, in reality, we can create this effect using the shutter speed and managing the shutter speed. So we already talked about the shutter speed management and other settings of the camera in the video dedicated to camera. Now, I just want to show you here the output. So I created a folder which I called animation, and should be here somewhere. There you go. So you can output your animation in two ways, basically. You can output a video file, and this is a really short animation in EV render. You can render with EV, you can render with cycles, but in my opinion, if you don't have a really strong machine, yes, really strong computer, you should stay with EV because it's gonna be faster and, well, it's not so bad. And also keep in mind that with animation, since you need to render a lot of frames, you need to keep everything as low poly as you can. So you need to optimize your scene the best you can. You need to optimize materials. You need to optimize lights and lighting and everything that we talked also in other lessons. So be careful. Don't create a heavy scene because that's going to be an heavy render. And if it's a heavy for a single render, just imagine to render like thousands of frames, thousands of images. So the other way you can render out an animation in Blender is to create a sequence of images. So in this case, this is a sequence of PNG files. And in that case, you can also get rid of the background. So you're gonna have a transparent background, and you can use a video editing software like Premiere Pro, or if you want, you can use like open source Shotcut or OpenShot to create an image sequence like this. So you're gonna like create an animation using the images. Now you can also see here from the still images the motion blur effect of the moving camera, and also right here you can see a little bit of depth of field. Let me show you. There you go. So you have this kind of character in the foreground in focus, and then you have the background there which is out of focus. So this is the two ways you can output an animation. Well, in my opinion, in both ways, you need to go down into a video editing software to continue your work, add, for example, some video effects and montage and things like that. Okay, so that's the output. Let's see some files here to begin with, and also a little bit of theory to begin with. Now, the first thing, if you want to use the models that I'm using in this exercise, in this lesson, you can go into Sketchfab, search for this file here, just check the spelling. So I'm using this one here because it's really simple. It's really low poly, doesn't have complex geometry inside, so you can use it to test your abilities in animating stuff. And also it's like architecture, so I can animate things inside and lights and things like that. And I'm also a fan of architecture, so this is a good model. And also you can get this really beautiful Lamborghini Centenario So just search for Lamborghini Centenario. You will find models here, also other nice Lamborghini models that you can download and use. In this case, I've chosen this one here. So this is also the author, and you can download here, and you must give credit to the author. Here as well, you can download and give credit to the author. And these are both Blender files, so you will find materials in Blender and everything in Blender. We actually used this file before with the HDRI Lightning lesson, and this one also for the rendering, exterior rendering lesson. Now let me go back into the scene here. Just gonna start with a simple layout. So just copy and paste the Lamborghini inside the rest of the model, or do whatever you want. And I'm using right now also dynamic sky and the sun that we talked about those topics earlier in the course. Now, what we can see here, if I use my standard layout, and by the way, if you don't have the timeline down there, you can just, I'm gonna show you here, you can click and drag and go here and apply the timeline. Let me switch quickly from Italian to English for you guys. Okay, so you can see this is the main tool, the simpler way you can use animation in Blender. Now another way is to use the other editor here, which is called the, sorry about that, the dope sheet right there. So this is a little bit more complex. You can expand here, you have possibility to select, for example, different objects. Now if I show you the animated car, there you go, you can see that it's represented a little bit different here. So this is the dope sheet. It's kind of more complex than the simple timeline, but they do essentially pretty much the same thing. So they will help you to manage the animated objects. Now you can see there where the animation starts and when it finishes. Now it's all about frames. What you see in the timeline or in the dope sheet, or also the third one of the primary editors here for animation, is the graph editor. Now this is a graphic editor based on curves. So what you see here, like straight lines or simply like little dots, here you will see like curves. So all the movements or the animations, everything you do is going to be represented with curves, and you can change the interpolation, but we're gonna explain what all this stuff is in just a minute. So for the really beginners here, well, this is the timeline. The timeline is composed by frames. So each of these little number here represent a frame. Now, if you move here using this CTI, current time indicator, you can click and drag. You are actually moving into time. So right now I'm telling this car to activate or to start to move to this frame right here, which is the 177, and then to stop at 232. So you can check the number of the frame right there. You can also move frame by frame, or you can insert a precise frame, let's say 25. Now we also need to understand and set up the frame rate, or FPS, which means frame per second. So if I consider to be working with 25 frames per second, it means that in 1 second of animation I'm gonna have 25 frames, which means that I'm gonna have 25 images that I'm going to put in a sequence. Now I can also use this player to go back and forward, play the animation, go to the first and go to the last frame, go to the previous keyframe, go to the next keyframe. So it's a really handy player right here that can help you to work with the timeline as well as the dope sheet and the curve editor. So they all share the same logic, which is based on frames essentially. So let's do a little bit of theory. Now frames are divided into keyframes and interpolation frames. Now the keyframes are the most important ones because they actually give the indication of where the object should be in a precise time and in a precise place. Now everything else, which is going to be like developed by the machine itself, by the software, is going to be the interpolation frames. Now in the past, when people created animated movies, animated cartoons like Disney's or wherever, or anime, whatever, they need to design and draw each single frame. So if they have an animation of 25 frames per second, they needed to design and draw all the 25 frames. Now, thanks to technology, we don't need to do that. We just need to set up some few keyframes, and the rest is going to be done by the computer and by the software. So this is really let's say a relief, because that was really hard to animate each single frame or to draw each single frame. So what you usually do here is gonna be this: you're gonna set up a set of keyframes just like in this example here, and the rest, the interpolation, is gonna be done by the software. So there are different types of interpolation, as I already told you, but we're gonna see those later in practice. But you can see here's also some example interpolations. So some are straight, some are curves, some are different curves with handles, and so on. Now the other really important term is FPS, which means frame per second. And this is going to be how many images, how many frames you want to have in 1 second of animation. Now this is really important. Why? Because one thing is to render 30 frames or 30 images. One thing is to render 120. So it's just going to be a different work for your machine. You're going to make it harder or easier for your machine. Now, the let's say the minimum frame per second value should be 24 frames per second. That's going to create a nice and fluid animation or video if you are using also a camera and you want to record. Now, lower than that, like 10 frames per second, you would have like old movies effect or like stop motion effect, and so you start to see the images in a sequence. Now when you go to 30 frames per second or 45 or 60, you won't be able to perceive and really understand that you're watching a sequence of images, but you're gonna your mind, your brain is gonna perceive that just like in reality, like an animated object, a movie object. So this term FPS is also used in video games, so in smartphones, you will find it anywhere. Just remember that you are just managing the number of images that you're gonna put in a second of animation. So we're gonna see how we can set up that also in Blender. Now, before we actually get into action, I just want to suggest you a couple of software that can help you to create animation really easy and without spending too many resources in terms of machine, in terms of personal computer, a graphic card, and so on. Now, the first one is going to be Twinmotion, which is from Unreal Engine